I didn't set out to question train stations, they're just there. Monuments to progress, temples of the industrial age, or at least that's what I'd always assumed. But the deeper I looked into the history of global rail infrastructure, the more certain details refused to make sense. Not minor inconsistencies, major ones, the kind that make you step back from your research and ask a question you never intended to ask. What if the railroads weren't what we think they were? Let me show you what I mean. Grand Central Terminal in New York, completed 1913. Look at the ceiling, an astronomical mural spanning 12,000 square feet, painted in reverse, showing the Mediterranean sky with 2,500 stars rendered in gold leaf against a teal-green firmament. The main concourse, 275 feet long, 120 feet wide, 125 feet high at its peak. All of it finished in Tennessee marble and adorned with statuary that wouldn't look out of place in a cathedral for a train station. Now look at Leipzig Hauptbahnhof in Germany, completed 1915. The largest terminal station in Europe by floor area, 8.5 acres under one roof. A facade stretching nearly 1,000 feet, studded with 6 towers. Inside, a hall of such proportions that early photographs struggle to capture its scale. The iron and glass vault above the platforms rises 115 feet into the air for trains that ran on coal and steam. Or consider Victoria Terminus, completed 1887. They called it a cathedral to steam. Gothic Revival architecture blended with Indian palace motifs featuring domes, spires, pointed arches, and stained glass windows. The central dome rises to 225 feet. Stone carvings depicting flora and fauna cover nearly every surface. Gargoyles, flying buttresses, an ornate entrance that could serve as the gateway to a royal palace. To move people between trains, the official explanation is clear. These were statements of national pride, monuments to industrial achievement, symbols of progress and power. The Gilded Age loved grandeur. Empires competed through architecture. Money was no object when prestige was at stake. And yet, why did every major city do this? Not some, not many. Every single one. Paris, Milan, Antwerp, Madrid, Sao Paulo, Melbourne, Tokyo, Calcutta, Cape Town, cities across 6 continents representing vastly different cultures and economic circumstances, all decided simultaneously, within a span of roughly 60 years, to build train stations that resembled power plants, temples, or palaces far more than they resembled transportation hubs. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Here's where it gets stranger. In the United States alone, between 1850 and 1920, over 1,000 substantial train stations were constructed. Not simple platforms or wooden shelters. I'm talking about permanent structures featuring elements like clock towers, waiting halls with 40-foot ceilings, ornamental facades, and heating systems that serviced vast interior spaces. Many incorporated electric lighting from the moment they opened, this in an era when most homes still used gas or oil lamps. They built them everywhere. Towns of 5,000 people got stations that could accommodate 5,000 people at once. Rural stops featured architectural flourishes, arched windows, decorative brickwork, copper roofing, granite foundations, elaborate ventilation systems. Why? The official answer: optimism, rapid expansion, speculation about future growth, competition between railroad companies creating a building arms race. But here's what that explanation requires you to accept: that hundreds of independent railroad companies operating in economic competition with one another somehow coordinated to build structures of remarkably similar design, using comparable materials and methods, often completing them within years of each other, all while following architectural principles that suggest what? A shared blueprint, common instructions, access to the same technical knowledge. And here's the strangest part. Many of these stations feature identical architectural elements despite being separated by thousands of miles, and constructed by entirely different organisations. The same style of clock tower, the same proportions in the waiting halls, the same type of brick, the same window arrangements, the same roof angles, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button, because what comes next gets significantly more difficult to explain. Let me ask a simple question. What powered these buildings? The standard answer is steam. Coal-fired boilers producing steam for heating, sometimes supplemented by gas lighting, later by electricity generated off-site. Basic industrial age technology, nothing mysterious. Except when you actually examine the infrastructure, that answer collapses. Consider the heating systems alone. Many grand terminals featured radiant heating capable of maintaining comfortable temperatures throughout spaces, measuring hundreds of thousands of cubic feet. The Gare du Nord in Paris, Union Station in Washington, D.C., King's Cross in London. These weren't small buildings with a few radiators. We're talking about climate control for cathedral-sized volumes, requiring thousands of BTUs per hour, and somehow accomplishing this efficiently enough that the stations remained in continuous operation year-round. The fuel costs alone should have been astronomical. The labour required to maintain coal-fired boilers of sufficient size should have necessitated dozens of workers per shift. The soot and smoke should have blackened these buildings beyond recognition within years. And yet, photographs from the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s show pristine white marble, clean glass interiors that look barely used despite hosting thousands of passengers daily. Where's the coal smoke residue? Where are the massive boiler rooms these systems would have required? Where are the coal delivery systems, the ash removal operations, the ventilation infrastructure to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning? They're not there. Or rather, they're not there in sufficient scale to match the demands these buildings would have placed on 19th century steam technology. This raises a simple but critical question. When did these stations get electricity? Official records say most major terminals were electrified in phases, lighting first, then machinery, then entire operational systems. Often this occurred decades after initial construction. Grand Central, for instance, supposedly operated on gas lighting until its major renovation in 1913. But when you look at the original architectural drawings, the ones that survived, many show electrical conduit systems built into the foundations, not added later. Built in, from the beginning. Channels for wiring running through walls that wouldn't be electrified for another 20 years. Rooms sized and positioned like electrical substations labelled as storage or mechanical spaces in the official documentation. Why would you build electrical infrastructure before electricity was commercially available in that area? Union Station in Los Angeles. Construction began 1914. The building incorporated electrical systems from day one. This in a city where large-scale electrical distribution was still being established, where most residential areas wouldn't get reliable power for another decade. The station had it immediately. Not just lights, full climate control, electrically operated signalling systems, elevators, all functioning from the moment the building opened. How? The deeper I went into electrical records, the more the timeline fractured. Stations supposedly powered by steam showing power consumption records from years before local electrical grids existed. Buildings consuming massive amounts of electricity, megawatts, in eras when generating that kind of power should have required visible, dedicated power plants nearby. But the power plants aren't in the records. Or if they are, they're described in vague terms: municipal supply, private generation, industrial source. Never specifics, never actual facilities you can locate on a map or find architectural documentation for. The silence was deafening. And that's where the temporal aspect becomes impossible to ignore. Before the railroads, time was local, solar time. Each town set its clocks based on the sun's position overhead. Noon in Chicago was several minutes different from noon in Cleveland. This was fine until trains started running between cities on schedules. The solution, we're told, was standardization. Railroad companies established time zones. In the United States, this happened in 1883, not by government mandate, but by private railroad coordination. 4 time zones established simultaneously, adopted by every major railroad company on the same day, November 18th, 1883. Think about that. Competing companies, many hostile to one another, all agreed to abandon locally observed solar time and adopt an artificial system of standardized hours. They coordinated this across an entire continent. They implemented it universally, instantly, without government enforcement. And the public just accepted it. By 1918, Congress made it official, but the railroads had already been operating on standardized time for 35 years. 35 years of the entire nation organizing its daily life around railroad time rather than solar time. Work schedules, meal times, business hours, sleep cycles, all realigned to an artificial temporal grid. Why did this work? How did this work? We're talking about fundamentally altering how human beings experience and measure the passage of time, accomplished not through gradual cultural evolution but through corporate decree. Unless the railroads weren't just transportation companies, unless they were something else. Consider the physical layout of railroad networks. Tracks spreading outward from central hubs, the grand terminals like spokes on a wheel, or like distribution lines from a generating station. The rails themselves, parallel metal conductors separated by wooden ties stretching for thousands of miles, connecting every major population centre and countless minor ones. A perfect electrical grid. Now consider what we know about the early electrical system. Edison's DC power could only transmit effectively over short distances. Tesla's AC system could go farther but required substantial infrastructure. The electrical grid as we know it today, the one powering your home right now, didn't fully materialize until the 1920s and 30s. But the railroad network was complete by 1890. Every major city connected, most minor ones too. Millions of miles of parallel metal rails with elaborate terminal buildings positioned at regular intervals, all constructed within roughly 60 years. What if the railroads weren't primarily about moving people? What if they were about moving power? Look at the architectural evidence again with this in mind. Those enormous halls aren't just for passengers, they're for housing equipment. Those towers aren't just decorative, they're for transformers or receivers. Those copper roofs aren't ornamental, they're conductive. Those foundations aren't over-engineered, they're grounding systems. The ventilation systems aren't for air, the mechanical rooms aren't for steam, the storage spaces aren't for luggage. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But here's what breaks the conventional narrative completely. This happened everywhere, all at once. Europe, the Americas, Asia, Africa, Australia. From the 1850s through the 1910s, urban centres across the planet underwent identical transformations. Railroad stations appeared massive and ornate, tracks spread outward, time standardized. Electrical infrastructure manifested often before electricity was supposedly available. There was no internet, no telephones initially, no rapid global communication. Travel between continents took weeks or months, and yet, somehow, cities separated by oceans built nearly identical railroad infrastructure following the same architectural principles during the same narrow historical window. The coordination required for this is impossible, not improbable. Impossible. Unless everyone was working from the same blueprint, unless they were inheriting or repurposing existing infrastructure, unless someone or something provided the knowledge, the plans, the technology. This is where Tartaria enters the conversation, not as an empire, not as a specific civilization, but as a placeholder term for something we've lost. a previous level of technological achievement that the historical record either doesn't contain or has actively obscured. Because here's what the evidence suggests: these buildings weren't built for steam-age railroads. They were too advanced, too sophisticated, too uniform. They were designed for something else, then adapted, perhaps imperfectly, to serve transportation needs once the original purpose was forgotten or could no longer be fulfilled. The mud flood photographs show it. Those images of 19th century cities with buildings buried to their second floors, ground levels that were clearly once first floors, staircases descending into earth. The official explanation is land elevation, urban fill, geological settling. But when you find the same pattern in cities worldwide, when you see railroad stations with lower levels that show signs of previous use, when architectural features only make sense if the building once sat several feet higher, what happened? Not gradual burial, not slow sediment accumulation, not decades of urban development, but something rapid enough that entire cities adjusted their street levels to match, something universal enough that it affected every continent simultaneously, something we've somehow agreed not to discuss in official histories. The railroad stations survived it, or were built immediately after it. And they came online with technological capabilities that supposedly didn't exist yet, powered by energy systems we're told were still decades away from development, all coordinated across a planet that lacked the communication infrastructure to coordinate anything. And then, suddenly, they stopped. By 1920, the era of grand terminal construction was over. Stations continued to be built, but they were different, functional, modern, utilitarian, Art Deco instead of Beaux-Arts, steel and concrete instead of marble and copper, smaller, simpler, designed explicitly for transportation rather than whatever those earlier buildings were designed for. The old ones were often demolished. Penn Station in New York, destroyed in 1963. A building so magnificent that its loss sparked the historic preservation movement. Chicago's Grand Central Station, demolished 1969. Broad Street Station in Philadelphia, demolished 1952. Dozens of others gone. Not deteriorated beyond repair, not outdated, demolished on purpose. The ones that survived were often converted to other uses or allowed to decay, or they were renovated in ways that gutted their internal infrastructure, replacing original systems with modern equivalents, removing the very elements that might tell us what they actually were, as if someone was erasing evidence. So, what were they? Energy receivers, distribution hubs, resonance chambers, something utilizing the rails themselves as a transmission system, drawing on power we no longer know how to access or acknowledge. Why did railroad time replace natural time? Was it really just scheduling convenience, or was temporal synchronization necessary for the system to function? Why did construction stop so abruptly in the 1920s? What changed? What was lost? What did we forget or choose to forget? And why is there so little documentation? For an era supposedly obsessed with record keeping, for buildings that cost millions to construct and employed thousands, the paper trail is suspiciously thin. Architectural plans missing, construction photographs rare, detailed technical specifications non-existent, financial records vague. The official story requires us to believe that competing companies with no coordination mechanism simultaneously decided to build identical infrastructure across 6 continents using technology they supposedly didn't have, powered by systems that left no physical evidence, all while keeping remarkably poor records of the entire process. That's not history. That's mythology pretending to be history. I stand now in Union Station, Los Angeles, the same building I mentioned earlier. I'm looking up at the ceiling, at the wooden beams and chandeliers, at the architectural details that supposedly serve no purpose beyond aesthetics. But I'm seeing something else now. Channels, patterns, symmetries that engineering would call redundant, but physics might call resonant. The building is still here, still functional, still beautiful, still silent about what it really was. The evidence suggests something much larger than we've been told. A global network, an energy infrastructure, a level of technological sophistication that vanished or was made to vanish within a single generation. Knowledge lost so completely that we now teach its pale shadow as the pinnacle of achievement, the forbidden energy of the railroad empires. Maybe it's still here. Maybe it never left. Maybe we're standing in the middle of it right now, using 5% of its capability, calling it progress, and wondering why the buildings our great-grandparents casually constructed still dwarf anything we make today. The stations remain, the rails remain, the towers still stand, but the power, the real power, is gone. Or is it? That's the question that keeps me up at night, because once you see the pattern, once you recognize the impossibility of the official explanation, you can't return to comfortable certainty. You're left with something far more unsettling, the knowledge that we might be living in the ruins of a world we don't remember, using tools we don't understand, following maps to a destination we've forgotten. The forbidden energy of Tartaria, if you want to call it that, or call it something else. Name it however you want. The mystery remains the same. What did they know that we don't, and why don't we know it?